In the summer of 1873, a hide hunter on the southern plains of North America could stand in one spot and shoot until his rifle barrel was too hot to hold. In front of him stretched a herd of bison so vast that travelers swore it could take days to ride past. He was not hunting for meat. He took the hide, sometimes the tongue, and left the rest of the animal to rot on the grass. Within a few short years, hunters like him killed the bison by the millions. A species that had once numbered perhaps 30 to 60 million was driven to the very edge of extinction. By 1889, a careful count could find only a few hundred wild bison left alive in all of North America. And this was not an accident. Army officers and politicians understood that the bison were the food, the shelter, and the freedom of the native nations of the plains. Destroy the herds, and you destroy the people who lived by them. Kill the wild cattle, and you could put your own cattle in their place. Because what came onto that emptied grassland next was beef, domestic cattle by the millions, driven north to feed the cities of a hungry, growing nation. How did a slow, heavy animal, first tamed at the dawn of farming, become powerful enough to clear a continent? How did beef go from a rare feast to something you can grab, shrink-wrapped, for the price of a sandwich? To understand that, we have to go back more than 10,000 years to a wild ancestor most people have never even heard of. The animal we casually call the cow did not always exist. Its wild ancestor was the aurochs, and it was nothing like the placid creature in a modern field. An aurochs bull could stand taller than a man at the shoulder, with long, forward curving horns and a temper to match. These were among the largest and most dangerous land animals across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans could only hunt them, paint them on cave walls, and keep their distance. Then, around 10,500 years ago, in the hills of the ancient Near East, something remarkable happened. People began to keep them. Not chase and kill them, but hold them, feed them, and breed the calmest ones together. Recent genetic studies suggest that almost every cow alive today descends from a tiny founding herd, perhaps only around 80 tamed aurochs. From that handful of animals came an idea that would reshape human life. A cow was not just meat you had to run down and kill. It was meat that walked beside you and waited. It was milk day after day after day. It was leather, horn, bone, and dung for fuel and fields, and above all, it was muscle. A pair of oxen could pull a plow through heavy soil that no human could break alone. For the first time, a family could store wealth that fed itself, bred itself, and worked for them. The wild aurochs, meanwhile, was slowly hunted and crowded out of the world. The very last one died in a forest in Poland in 1627. By then, its tamed descendants had spread across continents and become something far more powerful than any wild beast. They had become wealth itself. In the ancient world, cattle were not counted as food first. They were counted as fortune. A person's standing, their power, even the price of a bride could be measured in head of cattle. Our own language still carries the memory of it. The Latin word for money, pecunia, comes from pecus, the word for cattle. The English word cattle shares a root with the words chattel and capital. Long before coins existed, a cow on the hoof was a unit of value you could drive from one place to another. Because cattle were so precious, many peoples came to see them as sacred. In ancient Egypt, a great bull was honored as a living god, and the cow was tied to a powerful goddess of the sky. In the lands of the Indus and the Ganges, the cow became a symbol of life and gentleness, protected rather than eaten. Across Africa, entire cultures built their marriages, their songs, and their daily lives around their herds. To raid a neighbor and carry off their cattle was one of the oldest and most celebrated acts of war. One of the great epics of early Ireland is built entirely around a raid for a single prized bull. Wherever cattle went, they carried meat, milk, labor, and status all in one body. But for most of this long history, beef itself, the simple act of eating the animal, stayed something rare. You did not slaughter the creature that plowed your field and held your wealth without a serious reason. Beef was for the feast, the festival, the sacrifice, and the table of the powerful, and that was about to turn it into the ultimate symbol of who ruled and who served. In medieval Europe, meat marked the line between the lord and the laborer. A great roast turning over an open fire was a show of power that everyone in the hall could see and smell. Nowhere did this love of beef sink deeper into a national identity than in England. The English came to picture themselves as a nation of hearty beef eaters, sturdy and free. The famous guards at the Tower of London earned the nickname beef eaters from the meat in their rations. Roast beef became a patriotic symbol, sung about as the very source of English courage. But Europe was running short of room to graze ever larger herds. And then, in 1492, two worlds collided, and the story of beef burst outward. The Americas had no cattle at all. When Columbus returned on his second voyage in 1493, he carried cattle with him across the Atlantic. On the warm grasslands of the New World, with few predators and endless space, those animals multiplied beyond anyone's imagination. Spanish cattle spread through the Caribbean, into Mexico, and up into the plains and deserts of the future American Southwest. They escaped, turned wild, and formed huge roaming herds. To manage them, a new kind of mounted herder appeared, expert with rope and horse. In the Spanish-speaking world, he was the vaquero. Later in English, he would be given a name the whole world now knows. The cowboy. A fragile feast food had found a continent of grass, and the modern beef empire was about to be born. By the middle of the 1800s, the United States looked west and saw a sea of grass. But the Great Plains were not empty. They were home to powerful native nations whose lives moved with the bison herds. For those nations, the bison was almost everything: food, clothing, shelter, tools, and the heart of their beliefs. And so, the destruction of the bison became a weapon. As railroads pushed across the continent, hunters slaughtered the herds for hides and for sport, sometimes firing from train windows. Some military leaders openly encouraged it because a plains without bison was a plains where the nations could be starved onto reservations. This is the dark center of the story, and it is important to be honest about it. The grasslands were not opened by cattle. They were emptied of one people and one animal to make room for another. Onto that cleared land came the great cattle drives. Cowboys pushed enormous herds north from Texas to the railheads, where the animals could be loaded and shipped east. Fortunes were made almost overnight. Wealthy investors, some from as far away as Britain, poured money into open-range cattle companies. For a few wild years, cattle barons ran herds across land they did not own and could barely control. The profits were enormous, and the whole system looked unstoppable. But it was built on overgrazed grass, brutal labor, and a gamble against the weather. That gamble was about to come due. If you are enjoying this hidden history, take a second to subscribe. Every week we dig up the forgotten story behind something on your plate, and the hardest part of this one is still ahead. The winter of 1886 and 1887 came down on the northern plains like nothing the ranchers had ever seen. After a scorching summer had burned the overgrazed grass to dust, the cold arrived early and refused to leave. Blizzard after blizzard buried the open range under deep snow and ice. The cattle, too many for the land and with nowhere to shelter, could not reach the grass underneath. They drifted with the wind, piled against fences, and froze where they fell. When the snow finally melted in spring, the rivers carried away the bodies of countless animals. Some outfits lost half their herds. A few lost almost everything. Ranchers called it the Great Die-Up, a bitter joke on the roundup that should have come instead. In a single season, the dream of free open-range cattle wealth collapsed. The survivors learned a brutal lesson. You could not just turn animals loose on the grass and grow rich. You had to fence the land, grow hay, control the breeding, and feed the cattle through the winter. The romantic age of the cowboy was already ending, even as it hardened into legend. What replaced it was something far more powerful and far less free. Surviving the crisis meant turning the animal and the entire business around it into a machine. The center of that machine was a single city: Chicago. There, beginning in the 1860s, the great stockyards grew into a city of animals, holding tens of thousands of cattle and hogs at once. Inside the packing houses, workers broke each animal down piece by piece as it moved past them on overhead rails. Every worker made the same cut, over and over, all day long. It was called the disassembly line, and a young Henry Ford later said it gave him the idea for the assembly line that built his cars. The modern factory was born in part on the killing floors of the meat packers. Then came refrigeration. A businessman named Gustavus Swift backed the development of the refrigerated railroad car in the late 1870s. Now beef could be slaughtered in Chicago and shipped, kept cold, to the cities of the East and even across the ocean. A handful of giant packing firms came to rule the entire trade, so powerful they were known as the Beef Trust. They drove down what they paid for animals and squeezed out smaller butchers everywhere. But inside those packing houses, the conditions were dangerous and often filthy. In 1906, a writer named Upton Sinclair laid them bare in a novel that horrified the public. He had hoped to make people care about the workers. Instead, sickened by his descriptions of the meat itself, they demanded clean food. That same year, the United States passed landmark laws to inspect meat and regulate food and drugs. Beef had become an industry vast enough to feed nations and to force a government to act. As beef grew cheaper and more plentiful, it worked its way into ordinary life. It moved from the holiday table to the everyday plate, and one humble form of it would go on to conquer the world. Ground beef, cooked into a patty and tucked into a bun, became known as the hamburger. The exact moment of its invention is argued over by several American towns, each claiming to be its birthplace. But however it truly began, its future was enormous. In the years after the Second World War, a new idea took hold in America: sell a tiny menu, made fast, exactly the same way every single time. A pair of brothers built a quick, efficient burger stand, and a salesman turned their idea into the largest fast food empire on earth. The hamburger became a symbol of American life, sold on nearly every continent. Beef was now cheap, fast, and everywhere. A steak became the reward for a hard week, a burger the meal of an ordinary afternoon. Backyard grills, drive-thrus, lunch counters, and freezer aisles all ran on it. For the first time in history, beef was not a luxury or a feast. It was simply expected, 3 times a day if you wanted it. But all that cheap, endless meat was hiding a cost the eaters never saw. That cost begins with land, and there is never enough of it. Cattle need vast space to graze and vast fields of grain to fatten on. Today, raising cattle is the single largest driver of the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. Across the Amazon, roughly 80% of the cleared land ends up as cattle pasture. Forest that took thousands of years to grow is burned away to make grass for beef, much of it bound for export. Cattle change the air as well as the land. As they digest grass, cattle release large amounts of methane, a gas that warms the planet far faster than carbon dioxide. With around 1.5 billion cattle on Earth, that adds up to a serious share of the emissions heating our world. Most beef no longer comes from open pasture at all. It comes from the feedlot, where thousands of animals stand in crowded pens and are fattened quickly on grain. To keep them growing in those conditions, the industry has long leaned on routine drugs, raising real fears about antibiotic resistance. The business has grown narrow as well as large. In the United States, just 4 companies now control around 80% of all the beef that gets packed. The people who raise the cattle often struggle, while the companies that process it capture the profit. And the work inside the slaughterhouses remains some of the most dangerous in the country. It is done very often by immigrants and the poor, far from the diners who enjoy the result. There are health questions too, and they deserve honesty rather than fear. Researchers have linked heavy consumption of red and processed meat to certain health risks, though scientists still debate exactly how large those risks are. The point is not that beef is poison. The point is that the real price of cheap beef is paid somewhere you cannot see it. So think about the beef in your kitchen right now. The package of ground meat, the steak in the freezer, the patty waiting for the grill. There are roughly 1.5 billion cattle alive on the planet at this moment, more than at any time in history. They take up a staggering share of all the farmland on Earth, far more than any other animal we raise. Beef feeds billions of people and supports the livelihoods of countless herders, ranchers, and workers. And it all began with a wild, dangerous beast that ancient people somehow chose to tame. From a founding herd of perhaps 80 animals came a force that measured wealth, crowned kings, and carried the very word for money. It crossed an ocean, multiplied on a new continent, and helped clear that continent of its first peoples and its wild herds. It collapsed in a killing winter, was rebuilt as a factory, and was flattened into a patty sold on every corner of the world. The next time you unwrap a piece of beef for the price of a sandwich, remember what you are really holding. You are holding 10,000 years of wealth, worship, conquest, and machinery. Inside this ordinary meat is a history of empires raised, peoples uprooted, and forests falling even now. Beef was never just beef. If this changed the way you see what is on your plate, subscribe for more hidden histories behind the food we eat every day. And tell me in the comments which part surprised you the most. Next time, the history of bread, the simple loaf that built the first cities and toppled kings whenever it ran out. Until then, remember, there is always a hidden history behind the ordinary things.